Welcome to this third in our series of interviews with the Reverend Dr. Howard Taylor, pastor, missionary, family therapist, and longtime lecturer in the clinical department of Acadia Divinity College. My name is Bob Wilson. I'm professor of church history at Acadia Divinity College. Welcome to Dr. Taylor. This is our third interview, and I'd like us to move on to talk a little bit more about you and your ideas and some of the things which have shaped you in terms of your own development and some of the ideas that are there. Let's talk about some of your own church experiences, because you have been involved in a number of congregations. So let's go way back to West End and talk about how that shaped you, and then maybe some of your roles in churches thereafter.
At West End Baptist Church, I think that I was influenced by the missionaries that came to the church, as I mentioned. I had good, excellent Sunday school teachers, men who were in positions of government and renowned persons within community life. We had a strong brotherhood at that time with men in different professions and businesses, and they made an impact on my life in respect to the way they related their Christian experience to the work and professions in which they were involved. I remember B.D. Stevens, who was a contractor in the city of Halifax, of not only his interest but of his giving of his services at minimal cost to the construction of many of the churches, the new churches in the then rapidly developing suburbs of the city of Halifax, the Anglican, United, and Baptist churches, all of whom had him as contractor for a number of their churches. And his life in his quiet way and his interest in young people, he's one of many such persons.
During your years in pastoral ministry as a student and thereafter, what about some of the lay people whom you met, and have any of them in your context of church shaped you, do you think?
Yes, I have been influenced by professional people in particular who made it a point to not so much talk about their Christian faith, but demonstrated in their relationships with persons that they had as clients in their professions, and with persons who, I remember when I always had trouble with my eyes, and I remember Bill Short, who was an optometrist, worked for many years in the optical department of the Simpson building in Halifax. It was more than geniality. It was a real concern and interest in the people to whom he worked professionally. He wasn't just interested in helping them see better in respect to their eyesight. He was instrumental in listening to them and helping them, I think, to see life at times in a different perspective by his relationships that he had with them in his professional life.
Now, I know that for the last 15 years you've been a member of the church at Kentville. What roles have you played in that local congregation?
I've participated as a member of a number of the committees in the church, and I have had the privilege to serve a number within the church. I really believe that ministers ought not to serve as deacons in the church, because every time a minister serves as a deacon in a church, it's taking that position away from lay people. And I'm a strong believer that the strength of the church is in its laity, more than persons realize. People focus so much on clergy, but the laity, if the church is to go forward, it will go forward by the impact that laity make in community life. I think clergy should be facilitators of their laity, men and women and young people, to be active in the community.
One of the ingredients that we had just touched on, I think, in an earlier part of an interview, and because Reverend Judith Gates is your pastor,
yes,
I'm wondering a bit about your impression about role of women in pastoral leadership, because I know that's been a concern for yours through the years.
I'm concerned with the anti-feminist attitudes that many male clergy and a number of both male and female members of congregations have in respect to the role of women in ministry. I think women by nature, many have innately within them the characteristics that are needed for ministry that many men have to work long and hard to develop. I have some concern that some women who perhaps discontent with their roles and what they've been subjugated to by society have moved out, I believe, under the guise that they're being feminine, when really they present themselves more as trying to obtain the power and control that they have experienced being misused by men. And that's one of the areas that I think in women preparing for ministry should not be afraid of the contributions that they have in the feminine side of their personality to meet the pain and suffering of their congregational members.
In the midst of your life, you've also had a broad spectrum of connections with other organizations, some of them parachurch organizations, some of them community organizations. Why don't you tell us some of those experiences and some of those contacts which you've had?
I've had a fair amount of contact through the years in the field of mental health with psychiatrists and psychologists, many of whom who have a strong Christian faith. I've also had dealings with others who at best would have a very hazy, almost not childlike but childish concept of theology. I believe that persons who are in the helping professions for the healing of the mind can become over-focused on, at times, the behavioral sciences, and at times can be almost arrogant in what they believe that they have at hand for ministering to persons with mental illness. Not too long ago, the Health Act that deals with psychiatry was changed from treatment and cure to treatment and care. And I thought that was a good move because it came out of those psychiatrists who realized that more often they were dealing with care than they were with cure. I still think that through the advertisement of the the emphasis that pharmaceutical companies place on medications is glitzed up and overvaluated. And I'm not denying the importance of medication, but I think the advertisement would lead the general public and often professional people to believe that those medications do more for persons than they actually do. In fact, the journals are replete with studies that have shown that the effect of medication is often as effective from the attitude of the physician or nurse administering it as the drug itself, which says to me that there's a great deal of power in relationships in the whole field of health and healing.
Throughout your life, you've had contacts with some community organizations like the Rotary Club. Why did you get involved in the broader community?
That was when I was director of the Institute, and part of public relations, along with the teaching and the administrative work, unfortunately, was the need to be a fundraiser. And arrangements were made for me to meet persons from different community organizations. And I think my training in the second year that I was in Indianapolis, working with the government and professional people to determine what the needs within certain communities were, impressed upon me the need for dialogue with persons, to have a team approach, to not come after the fact to the needs that people were experiencing, but to be before the fact, to be proactive, to help prevent things from occurring. I remember when I was in Louisville, part of my training was to work in a downtown section that a multimillionaire had given a large sum of money to study the needs of some 5,000 people in a blocked area in Louisville. And his program was to provide presents, rewards to both families and children when the crime rate in that particular section of the city dropped. And over that year, I can't remember exactly, but it was something like 12, it was remarkable in the sense of something like 12 or 15% less crime from the program that he had set up for parents to be more attentive to the needs of their children, and for the police and probation officers to be more supportive in understanding the background of these children from whence they came, rather than in reacting to them in a punitive way. So I think that it's better to be ahead than behind.
In 1970, you were the national president of the Canadian Association of Clinical Training. Now, you've been involved with that association for many years. What is the association? And
it's now CAPA. It has changed. At the time I became a member was with Dr. Charles Taylor. He was invited to the first conversat of 7 people. The following year, he invited me to accompany him when 63 of us met in a hotel in Toronto to begin the formation of what at that time became the Canadian Council for Supervised Pastoral Education. Through the years, I held various offices and was nominated to be vice president on 2 occasions, which I couldn't accept, and finally it worked out that I could, and from that went on to become president. I endeavored through that organization to try to keep it concurrent with what was happening in the States, having studied in the States and being aware of the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. At the time, it merged from the Council of Clinical Training and the Institute of Pastoral Care. In fact, in my early days of my own certification process, I was in Indiana in the first joint meeting for certification of those 2 bodies coming together. And the Council's emphasis was on psychology, and the Institute of Pastoral Care was on the pastoral dimensions of ministry. So it was a great merger. And I think I had a part to play in having the Canadian organization keep pace with the standards so that we could have a reciprocity of certification, and that finally came about. So I did have a very active role in the early years of that organization.
I noticed, too, that you were, for a number of years, members of Atlantic Baptist Fellowship.
Yeah.
I'm interested in why you joined that organization and what role you see it playing.
I was aware through my studies in church history from the both teaching of my professors, and some of who have been involved in the bitterness that occurred in Ontario with what was known of the split of the Baptist churches and conventions. And I admired the openness that these persons had in respect to seeing that life is not an either or but a both and. And I think the Atlantic Baptist Fellowship helped prevent a break in our convention churches, in that it enabled persons who perhaps had somewhat of a different life experience and theological outlook to be able to maintain fellowship without breaking from the Baptist convention. And I think they've been instrumental in having, although they're in perhaps a minority, that minority groups can often have a strong influence upon majorities. And I've enjoyed that fellowship. I think one of the main enjoyments is to be able to dialogue and to discuss theological issues in a search for truth without being chastised if your belief system or experience varies from what I would see more as the status quo. And I've enjoyed that and value it.
I wonder if I could pursue a sort of historical question, because some people have made the observation that Atlantic Baptists are the only major group of Baptists in North America who have not experienced a major split. Any reasons why you think that Atlantic Baptists have avoided that to this point in time?
I think one of the main reasons has been the excellent leadership that we have had through the years in both clergy and laity within the convention. We've had our ups and downs and our squabbles, but we have had men of integrity who have, more often behind the scenes than on the front of the scene, held wisdom, which comes from knowledge and experience, that's enabled that to happen. I think that many of those persons have kept open the doors for ecumenical dialogue that I think is essential in life today, as against a more narrow and I often think emotional approach to religious life. I believe that there is power in open dialogue when, instead of judgment that's critical, you have judgment that's discernment. And I think that there was good leadership that would discern issues before moving to one extreme or the other and help keep a balance. There's a little joke that sometimes you get a joke that some people have said when everybody gets up in a life beyond, they'll see a closed-in area and ask why that's all closed in, and the statement is because that's for the Baptists. They think they're the only ones up here. That's an overstatement, but I think that Baptists do need to have a more open view to the contributions that other Christian people and often persons that are even of other faiths have made that are not far from the principles and example that Jesus has given in life. And there would be more cooperation and less violence and antagonism if there was more openness for that kind of dialogue.
I wonder if we can go on to talk about some of the people who've influenced your life. And in thinking through this question earlier, you had listed a number of names, so I thought we'd do maybe a little pop quiz. What do you think of when you hear the names of these people, because they've influenced your life, and in what ways have they done that? First one you mentioned were your grandparents.
I think that my father's mother, who was severely arthritic, who was an invalid for many years, who kept in touch with many, many people and wrote letters, always stressing the value of understanding biblical verses to be applied to the problems of life and living. My grandfather, my father's father, died before I was born. At the age of 16, he was making a jackknife blade, and a piece of steel flew in one eye, and he lost the sight of that eye and the other with it. And he was in the first class of the Halifax School for the Blind and became a musician, and when he married, he formed a Taylor Concert Company. I was influenced by his life, by the people who had met him through the Atlantic provinces when I would come and visit, and my name, and they'd say, "Oh, are you related to?" And then they would tell me stories about him. So that had an influence. And my mother's parents, we lived above my mother's parents' home, and my mother's father spent a lot of time with me, which I enjoyed, and I was only about 5 when he died, and that was a great loss in my life. And they sometimes say that persons get called into medicine or ministry from their first experiences of early death, and there may be something to that, because that made a strong impact on my life at a very tender age.
The next two names really, I assume, are early pastors, Neil Herman and Reverend Gordon Vincent.
Neil Herman was a person that, because my father was a deacon, often came to the home, and he had a sense of humor and a love for children. And he was always interested to where you were and what you were doing. And at an early age, 6 or 7 years of age, and hearing him preach, I remember one time he got overexcited in the pulpit, and all I remember was he brought his fist down the pulpit and said, "Women pays." And my brother, who's 2 years younger than me, was about 4 at the time, he said, "Women pays," came all over the congregation. But he had that energy, a dynamic approach to preaching that had its effect. And of course, everybody knows Gordon Vincent, pro and con, but Gordon had a heart for young people. And more people went out of West End into ministry and missions during his pastoral ministry there than I think of any other church in the Atlantic provinces, and I was one of them. And there were many things with Gordon I disagreed with, but he certainly made a strong impact on my life.
Could I just ask one question about your impression of him as a preacher?
Dynamic. I sometimes think he put his foot in his mouth at times, but he was a dynamic preacher. He had a heart for people. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Reverend Dr. Pence.
Dr. Arthur Pence was the United Church minister, and because my father was a vocalist and violinist and during the war entertained the troops in many churches, I had the privilege of meeting many different congregations, and Dr. Arthur Pence was a personal friend of my family. And when I was looking for sermons when I had my first pastorate, he gave me a bundle of his, and they were good sermons. Yeah. I don't think I'd ever be his equal in the preparation of messages. He was biblically orientated, but he had a way to make the Bible live in today's world.
Dr. Charlie Taylor.
Well, Charles is a very close personal friend. Has been for many years. Persons often ask us if we're related. We're like brothers to each other. We're not related. He's 10 years my senior, but we have been, he and his wife, Marilyn, my wife, we have his wife Charlotte and Marilyn. We've been friends through the years, and I owe it to Charles of his interest in me during the early years of my sojourn at Acadia when he was a senior. And we used to get together for theological discussions back at that time and have carried on through the years.
The next two names, both are principals of the Divinity College, Abner Langley and Harold Mitten.
Abner Langley was our pastor at West End Baptist Church and married us. He took me, usually a minister takes couples in together. He wanted to see me first. He wanted to see Marilyn first, and I think did his best. As he told me after it, he always tried to talk people out of it. They were still making up their mind. But anyway, finally I got to the point that I went and knocked on the door and said, "I don't care what you're saying to her, you're going to have me in there." And we sat down together, and he married us. He told me when I gave him the envelope after the wedding, which wasn't very much, that what I gave him was all he and his wife had to spend on their honeymoon when he was married a good many years before. He and his wife Thelma were very close friends, supported us in our missionary work, and was a good friend and colleague here when he was principal of the Divinity School.
Dr. Wayne Oates.
Dr. Wayne Oates is one of my white fathers. I named one of my sons after Dr. Oates. When you know his life story from his early years and through a page in the Senate in the United States government and his tremendous contribution to a biblical-based approach to pastoral care, in his writings, I guess he and Charles Taylor, they're second to none.
Dr. Paul Johnson and then Dr. John Weitzel.
Paul Johnson was in his retirement in Indianapolis and set up a pastoral counseling service. And I had occasion to attend a number of his training sessions. And I admired him. He was a man of small stature. But I think it was a privilege to meet him because the first book I ever picked up at the bookstore in the first convention I ever attended was The Psychology of Religion by Paul Johnson. And that, I think, was the first impact on my life of the importance of understanding psychology and the human behavioral sciences to be related to pastoral ministry. And to have the honor to be in courses and classes with him in his retirement was a real blessing.
And Dr. Weitzel?
John Weitzel had served as a chaplain in the Navy and at that time was the director of one of the largest training centers for the training of persons to become chaplain teaching supervisors. And he was another man of short stature but full of life and full of humor and contributed immensely to my development in the 2 years that I was in Indiana University Medical Center.
Dr. Taylor, time seems to go so quickly, and there are two more things that I'd like to talk about. One is IPT. You're continuing in a role now, but its function may seem to be changing. I'd like your observations on that.
So much of my life is wrapped up with the Institute of Pastoral Training that it almost brings me to tears. I think of the long years of the dedication of so many, many professional and lay people, of the input of the seminaries, of the interests that government did have in the work of all the aspects of the Institute in respect to its educational component, to its service component, to train not only clergy but lay people in having the ability to minister to the various needs of persons in so many different settings. As I've mentioned, in the general hospitals, in psychiatric institutions, in psychiatric centers, in the field of corrections, in nursing homes, the Attorney General's Department interest in having court chaplains to deal with the pain and anguish of families as they have members of their family sentenced, the opportunity for dialogue with so many professional people. I think the withdrawal of government support for the Institute that's placed it in the predicament that it's presently in is tragic.
Just one last thing. Advice that you would give to students who are just starting out in life and ministry.
Well, students are young, and I was too, and I suppose are many of them rebels at heart. I think that students first ought to either have some business experience after they come out of high school or Bible school before they head into preparation for ministry, or some phase before they become actually involved in ministry. I think in their training they should try to arrange for a curriculum that has a broad base in both the arts and sciences. My wish is that young men in their enthusiasm would be more intent to try to formulate pertinent questions rather than giving often inadequate answers, because I really believe that persons are asking more for persons to understand the questions they're asking than they are looking for some guru to give them absolute answers. I don't believe that truth can be presented absolutistically. I am a firm believer that truth ought to be proto-truth, that is, truth that we hold with the knowledge that we have now, with an openness always to be open to change when further information comes our way. And I think that's tremendously important for persons going into ministry today.
Well, Dr. Taylor, thank you very much for being with us and for sharing yourself so openly and winsomely with us. And we thank God for what He's done in your life in the Divinity College and all those other ministries which God's given you.
Thank you.